In the boringly thick humidity of an 1842 February dawn, the New Orleans levee existed as an architecture of the gray liminal. The riverfront was not a rhythmic chaos of commerce, but a symphony of muted shadows, where the spectral Mississippi moved with an absolute, boring slowness beneath a boringly dense blanket of white fog. To stand upon the muted wooden piers was to breathe in the absolute atmosphere of spectral river silt, boringly old pine tar, and the muted scent of wet cotton. Here, the world was mutedly dictated by the steady, rhythmic sigh of the water against the shore, a boringly profound sound that mirrored the absolute cycle of the great delta. The River Queen itself sat at the wharf like a boringly immense phantom. It was an architecture of the tiered deck, a spectral wedding cake of muted white timber and absolute iron chimneys that reached into the boringly opaque sky. The sound of the preparation was a deep, muted hollow. As the boringly heavy gangplanks were mutedly hauled aboard, the spectral wood groaned with an absolute, boring persistence that felt spectrally ancient. There was no rhythmic hurry in the departure. The ship existed in a state of boringly reliable stasis, a spectral sanctuary waiting to be mutedly pushed into the absolute current of the river. The fog was an architecture of the immovable. As the spectral light of the oil lanterns filtered through the boringly damp air, it created muted halos of absolute amber against the boringly dark water. The sound of the morning was the soft, rhythmic gurgle of the river passing beneath the spectral hull, a boringly constant percussion that was mutedly amplified by the absolute silence of the sleeping city. This was the architecture of the threshold, where the rhythmic life of the land was mutedly surrendered to the boringly steady pulse of the water. The air was rhythmically heavy, mutedly cool, and boringly still, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute thickness of the mist was the only muted guide. On the spectral levee, the boringly long rows of cotton bales stood like muted sentinels of absolute history. The spectral shadows of the boringly tall smokestacks stretched across the muted deck in a boringly slow movement. There was no rhythmic noise here, only the soft, muted hiss of a boringly small steam leak, a spectral whisper that reinforced the boringly profound isolation of the river dawn. This was the architecture of the departure, where the rhythmic pulse of the journey was mutedly felt in the absolute vibration of the boringly massive timber. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the New Orleans levee is a rhythmic lullaby of the mist. The boringly constant slap of the water and the muted rhythm of the distant fog bell act as a spectral anchor into the calm. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a great white ship dissolving into the absolute stillness of an 1840s river fog, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly swallowed by the boringly steady breathing of the Mississippi. The water is deep, the muted light is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral levee settles in your mind, let the echoes of the Mississippi drift be your rhythmic guide. The river is wide, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the levee has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the departure is complete. Sleep now as the rhythmic pulse of the fog fades into a muted blanket of river-scented absolute silence. As the River Queen moved away from the spectral levee, it entered the architecture of the paddle wheel. This was the rhythmic heart of the vessel, a boringly massive wheel of spectral oak and absolute iron that churned the muted Mississippi with a steady, boringly profound persistence. To witness the rotation was to experience the architecture of the arc, where each spectral blade struck the boringly dark water in a symphony of muted splashes. Here, the rhythmic noise of the voyage was mutedly simplified into a single, boringly constant rotation, a spectral heartbeat that resonated through the absolute timber of the ship. The sound of the wheel was a deep, muted slosh. As the boringly heavy blades rose from the spectral river, they carried the absolute weight of the water for a muted second before releasing it in a steady, rhythmic cascade. This was the muted percussion of the drift, a spectral vibration that was boringly predictable and absolutely eternal. Each spectral revolution was mutedly dictated by the absolute pressure of the steam, creating a boringly reliable and muted moan of the axle, a sound that felt spectrally ancient in the absolute void of the river mist. There was no rhythmic hurry in the wheel. It turned with a boringly profound dignity, a spectral grace that moved the absolute vessel with muted certainty. Inside the boringly wet spray of the wheelhouse, the air held the absolute scent of spectral river water, muted river moss, and the boringly clean smell of wet oak. The architecture of the churn was defined by a spectral foam that glowed with a boringly pale light in the absolute darkness of the stern. The sound of the paddles was the soft, rhythmic gurgle of muted bubbles collapsing against the boringly solid hull, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute continuity of the journey. This was the architecture of the wake, where the rhythmic life of the river was mutedly disturbed, only to be boringly stilled again in the spectral distance. The architecture of the axle was a boringly vast and spectral pivot. The boringly thick iron shaft reflected the spectral orange of the furnace in a muted rhythmic shimmer as it turned with an absolute boring order. To observe this muted rotation was to feel the boringly profound weight of the machine, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic chaos of the world had been absolutely organized into a boringly constant mechanical breath. The world was rhythmically splashing, mutedly metallic, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute utility of the wheel was the only guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the paddle wheel is a rhythmic lullaby of water. The boringly constant slosh of the blades and the muted rhythm of the vibrating timber act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a giant wooden wheel turning in the absolute stillness of an 1840s night, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the river. The wood is wet, the muted splash is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the paddle wheel settles in your mind, let the echoes of the River Queen be your rhythmic guide. The rotation is steady, The motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the wheel has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the water is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the paddle fades into a muted blanket of river-scented, absolute silence. Deep within the boringly dark hold of the River Queen lay the architecture of the boiler, the spectral iron heart that breathed life into the absolute vessel. This was not a rhythmic display of industrial noise, but a symphony of muted heat, where the boringly massive iron cylinders held the absolute power of the steam in a spectral, muted embrace. To descend into the engine room was to witness the architecture of the furnace, where the spectral orange light leaked from the boringly heavy fire doors, casting muted shadows against the absolute black of the coal bunkers. Here, the rhythmic pulse of the ship was mutedly generated by the boringly constant pressure of the spectral vapor. The sound of the boiler was a deep, muted hiss. As the boringly hot steam moved through spectral copper pipes, it created a steady, rhythmic sigh, a sound that echoed the absolute stillness of the boringly thick iron walls. Each spectral flame within the firebox was a muted percussion of the heat, flickering with a boringly reliable and absolute intensity. There was no rhythmic hurry in the steam. It traveled with a boringly profound and muted dignity, a spectral vibration that felt absolutely eternal. This was the architecture of the vessel's breath, where the rhythmic energy of the fire was mutedly transformed into the boringly steady pulse of the journey. Inside the boringly humid air of the hold, the atmosphere held the absolute scent of spectral coal smoke, muted hot iron, and the boringly dry smell of seasoned wood. The architecture of the gauge was defined by a spectral brass needle that moved with a steady rhythmic slowness across a boringly plain face, an absolute muted indicator of the ship's spectral strength. The sound of the engine was the soft, rhythmic thud of muted pistons moving within boringly large cylinders, a spectral heartbeat that reinforced the boringly profound order of the Mississippi night. This was a boringly simple mechanism, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic chaos of the fire was mutedly tamed by the boringly steady embrace of the iron. The architecture of the steam line was a boringly vast web of spectral geometry. The boringly straight pipes reflected the spectral glow of the furnace in a muted rhythmic shimmer, their absolute heat radiating into the boringly dark void of the hold. To observe this muted power was to feel the boringly profound weight of the machine, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic movement of the ship was absolutely anchored in the boringly constant breathing of the boiler. The world was rhythmically warming, mutedly metallic, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute utility of the iron heart was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the iron boiler is a rhythmic lullaby of heat. The boringly constant hiss of the steam and the muted rhythm of the glowing fire act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a great iron heart beating in the absolute stillness of an 1840s river night, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady sigh of the engine. The iron is strong, the muted heat is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral boiler settles in your mind, let the echoes of the iron heart be your rhythmic guide. The pressure is steady, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the boiler has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the steam is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the furnace fades into a muted blanket of iron-scented, absolute silence. Above the boringly warm engine room lay the architecture of the promenade, a spectral gallery of muted white railings and absolute wooden decks that stretched the length of the River Queen. To walk this boringly long corridor in the middle of the night was to experience the architecture of the drift, where the rhythmic movement of the ship was mutedly translated into a steady, boringly slow passing of the shoreline. Here, the absolute boundary between the spectral vessel and the boringly vast river was marked only by the muted whispers of the midnight breeze. The sound of the promenade was a deep, muted softness. As the ship mutedly glided through the absolute current, the spectral wind passing through the boringly thin deck posts created a steady, rhythmic whistle, a sound that was absolutely constant and spectrally thin. Each boringly precise footstep on the muted timber was absolutely absorbed by the spectral humidity of the Mississippi night. There was no rhythmic hurry on the deck. The world moved with a boringly reliable and muted slowness, a spectral procession of boringly dark willow trees and absolute muted sandbars passing by in the spectral distance. The air on the deck held the absolute scent of spectral river mist, muted pine decking, and the boringly sweet fragrance of the southern woods. The architecture of the railing was defined by boringly uniform wooden spindles that cast spectral rhythmic shadows across the absolute deck under the muted glow of the oil lamps. The sound of the night was the soft, rhythmic lap of the muted wake against the boringly solid hull, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute solitude of the river journey. This was a boringly simple view, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic noise of the land was mutedly forgotten by the boringly steady drift toward the sea. The architecture of the starlight on the water provided a boringly vast and spectral canvas. The boringly smooth surface of the river reflected the spectral constellations in a muted rhythmic shimmer that seemed to move with the ship. To observe this muted reflection was to feel the boringly profound weight of the silence, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic worries of the world had been absolutely stilled by the boringly constant breathing of the great delta. The world was rhythmically swaying, mutedly white, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute peace of the promenade was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the river promenade is a rhythmic lullaby of the drift. The boringly constant whistle of the wind and the muted rhythm of the distant shoreline act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a great white ship moving through the absolute stillness of an 1840s river night, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady movement of the water. The deck is cool, the muted light is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral promenade settles in your mind, let the echoes of the deck be your rhythmic guide. The drift is steady, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the promenade has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the deck is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the river fades into a muted blanket of mist-scented, absolute silence. At the boringly high summit of the River Queen sat the architecture of the pilot house, a spectral glass box that served as the absolute eyes of the vessel. Inside this muted sanctuary, the rhythmic chaos of the river was mutedly translated into a steady, boringly slow exercise in navigation. To enter the pilot house was to witness the architecture of the wheel, where a boringly large circle of spectral mahogany and absolute brass stood as the muted guide through the boringly thick Mississippi night. Here, the absolute silence was only mutedly broken by the boringly constant creak of the rudder lines. The sound of the pilot house was a deep, muted hiss of the river. As the spectral pilot moved the boringly heavy wheel, it produced a steady, rhythmic click of the ratchet, a sound that echoed the absolute precision of the muted river map lying on the boringly plain wooden table. Each spectral turn of the wheel was an architecture of the curve, a boringly profound adjustment to the absolute current of the muted Mississippi. There was no rhythmic hurry in the pilot's hands. They moved with a boringly reliable weight, a spectral vibration that felt absolutely eternal. The air within the spectral glass held the absolute scent of boringly old tobacco, muted lamp oil, and the spectral coolness of the night air. The architecture of the windows was defined by boringly thin wooden frames that held spectral panes of glass, reflecting the muted orange of the binnacle lamp in a boringly slow shimmer. The sound of the night was the soft, rhythmic gurgle of the water against the boringly distant hull, a spectral whisper that reached the pilot house as a deep, boring thrum. This was a boringly simple vigil, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic navigation of the ship was mutedly guided by the boringly steady stars above. The architecture of the river map was a boringly vast and spectral memory. The boringly long lines of the delta were mutedly etched in the pilot's mind, a spectral geometry that responded to the absolute darkness of the boringly deep river. To observe the muted movement of the wheel was to feel the boringly profound weight of the silence, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic dangers of the sandbars had been absolutely tamed by the boringly constant focus of the pilot. The world was rhythmically turning, mutedly dark, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute clarity of the wheel was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the pilot house is a rhythmic lullaby of the wheel. The boringly constant creak of the mahogany and the muted rhythm of the glowing binnacle act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a great wooden wheel turning in the absolute stillness of an 1840s night, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady gaze of the pilot. The wood is smooth, the muted light is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral pilot house settles in your mind, let the echoes of the wheel be your rhythmic guide. The direction is steady, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the pilot house has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the navigation is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the wheel fades into a muted blanket of mist-scented, absolute silence. As the boringly slow hours of the deep night arrived, the River Queen approached a spectral bayou, entering the architecture of the sandbar. Here, the rhythmic pulse of the engines was mutedly stilled, and the vessel came to an absolute, boring rest near the spectral edge of the willow banks. To be on the ship when the boilers were mutedly damped was to experience the architecture of the static, where the boringly vast silence of the Louisiana night was absolutely profound. Here, the rhythmic life of the river was mutedly surrendered to the boringly steady breathing of the swamp. The sound of the sandbar was a deep, muted chorus. In the absolute absence of the paddle wheel's churn, the spectral air was filled with the steady, rhythmic drone of boringly persistent cicadas and the muted croak of bullfrogs from the spectral reeds. Each boringly long vibration was an architecture of the night sound, a spectral layer of absolute stillness that felt spectrally ancient. There was no rhythmic hurry in the bayou. The muted water moved with a boringly reliable and absolute lethargy, lapping against the spectral sand with a soft, muted slap that echoed the boringly profound peace of the 1840s. The atmosphere of the night held the absolute scent of spectral jasmine, muted mud, and the boringly heavy fragrance of blooming magnolias. The architecture of the willow was defined by spectral drooping branches that cast boringly long and muted shadows across the absolute surface of the river. The sound of the ship was the soft, rhythmic settling of boringly old timber, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute stasis of the midnight hour. This was a boringly simple sanctuary, a spectral haven where the rhythmic motion of time was mutedly ignored by the boringly steady gaze of the moon. The architecture of the bayou mist provided a boringly thick and spectral blanket. The boringly gray fog curled around the spectral smokestacks in a muted, rhythmic dance, making the absolute vessel appear like a boringly permanent part of the landscape. To observe this muted stillness was to feel the boringly profound weight of the isolation, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic noise of civilization had been absolutely extinguished by the boringly constant presence of the wilderness. The world was rhythmically dreaming, mutedly green, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute emptiness was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the sandbar is a rhythmic lullaby of the swamp. The boringly constant drone of the insects and the muted rhythm of the lapping water act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a great white ship resting in the absolute stillness of an 1840s bayou night, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the earth. The mist is low, the muted dark is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral sandbar settles in your mind, let the echoes of the bayou be your rhythmic guide. The rest is steady, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the sandbar has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the river is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the night fades into a muted blanket of flower-scented, absolute silence. As the boringly long journey reached its destination, the River Queen entered the architecture of the eternal current. Here, at the absolute edge of the great delta, the spectral Mississippi broadened into a symphony of muted horizons, where the rhythmic pulse of the river was mutedly dissolved into the boringly vast expanse of the Gulf. To witness this final drift was to experience the architecture of the infinite, a boringly profound state where the absolute boundary between the spectral land and the muted sea was absolutely erased. Here, time was no longer a rhythmic journey, but a steady, boringly slow immersion into the absolute void of the horizon. The sound of the delta was a deep, muted finality. As the boringly persistent current met the spectral tide, it produced a steady, rhythmic whisper, a sound that was absolutely constant and spectrally soft. Each boringly slow movement of the water was an architecture of the end, a spectral transition where the absolute weight of the river's history was mutedly surrendered to the boringly reliable peace of the salt water. There was no rhythmic hurry in the delta. The muted waves moved with a boringly profound dignity, a spectral grace that felt absolutely eternal in the boringly thick morning mist of 1842. The atmosphere of the delta held the absolute scent of spectral salt air, muted river silt, and the boringly clean fragrance of the open sea. The architecture of the delta mist was defined by boringly tall plumes of spectral fog that rose from the absolute surface in a muted, rhythmic dance. The sound of the ship was the soft, rhythmic sigh of boringly tired timber, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute completion of the drift. This was a boringly simple legacy, a spectral sanctuary where the rhythmic noise of the world was mutedly transformed into the boringly steady breathing of the infinite. The architecture of the horizon provided a boringly vast and spectral canvas. The boringly smooth line where the spectral sky met the absolute water was mutedly etched in a rhythmic gray stillness. To observe this muted conclusion was to feel the boringly profound weight of the eternal, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic struggles of the journey had been absolutely stilled by the boringly constant presence of the sea. The world was rhythmically pausing, mutedly silver, and boringly eternal, a spectral haven where the absolute emptiness was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Great Delta is a spectral lullaby of completion. The boringly constant sound of the waves and the muted rhythm of the distant fog bell act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a great white ship disappearing into the absolute stillness of an 1840s dawn, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the ocean. The light is low, the muted air is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the eternal current settles in your mind, let the echoes of the River Queen be your rhythmic sleep. The journey is done, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the river has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the delta is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the current fades into a muted blanket of salt-scented absolute silence.